Shabbos, everybody. Good morning.
Shabbos.
Shabbos.
Shabbos, good Shabbos. All right, sorry a little late. We had some technical difficulties. We couldn't log on to people. People were here, we couldn't log on to them. It was too much. We couldn't see you, it was crazy. All right, got that. One little Mazonos, coffee. We're good. Everybody at home, you guys all coffee and ready? Coffee and ready? All right. All right. If anybody needs anything, it's over here. We can start. Zoe, Shabbos.
What's your name? Dominica.
Okay. So I think Dominica, you're the only one in the room that's here for the first time, right?
In person.
In person. Okay.
Wow. Nice.
Beautiful. All right. Let's start with Brechot HaTorah, everybody. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kashanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen. Amen.
Okay, let's learn. We have the, let's see. Everybody see the text? Yeah? All right, yalla. We're in chapter 48, everybody. The Borsha Vayechi is basically Yaakov's swan song. We're coming to the end of the book of Genesis, the end of Breshit, and Jacob will now work very hard to make sure that his legacy is secure. The parsha will begin with a deathbed. Well, actually, we'll begin with Jacob telling Joseph, "Make sure that you bury me in the land of Egypt, in the land of Canaan. Do not bury me in the land of Egypt. No matter what happens, don't bury me in the land of Egypt." It's very important to Jacob. And that's the end of chapter 47 and the beginning of the parsha. And then from that scene where he basically makes Joseph commit that no matter what, he makes him swear, even though Joseph will give him a promise which will be insufficient for Jacob. Jacob will say, "Nonetheless, please swear to me." Kishavali, Vaishavalo, and Joseph does swear to Jacob that he will indeed bury him, and also bury him with the brothers, which will be very important, right? For the brothers as well to be included in the burial of Jacob, and Joseph and the brothers to do it together. And then we arrive at chapter 48 of the book of Genesis, the story of the blessing of Jacob, of Joseph, where Joseph is blessed, as it were, or Joseph's progeny, his two children, two of the known children to Joseph are blessed. And the story of Jacob's blessing of Menashe and Ephraim, or Ephraim and Menashe, depending on how you, right? These two grandchildren of Jacob is a perplexing, powerful story, and we're going to be looking at it for the next 45 minutes too, okay? So, it was after these things. We're in source 1 here. Sometime afterward. What does that mean, sometime afterward? Sometimes after the first scene, right? The first scene where Jacob is making Joseph promise to bury him in Canaan. Joseph is told by some mysterious person, we don't know whom. Good morning. Shabbat Shalom. We're told that Joseph is told by someone, it doesn't say who it is. Your father is ill. According to the rabbis, the first time that somebody has become sick in the Torah, right? The first mention of being sick, being choleh. And so Joseph is now told that his father is choleh. And he takes his his sons with him, right? Et Menashe et Ephraim. Menashe and Ephraim. The Torah we'll put Menashe first. Menashe was, of course, is the firstborn. Anybody remember why Menashe, how he got his name? Anybody remember? I talk about this so frequently in the shul. The word Nashe is to forget. Ki nashani Elohim bebeit. Right? God has allowed me to forget my father's house. Menashe means I hopefully will forget where I came from, which is an amazing thing to name your son that. Not only because, I mean, everybody gets names in the Bible are very painful, but it's a remarkable thing to try to forget by remembering. Like you name somebody something in order to forget it, which of course does the opposite. You remember it constantly. And then Ephraim, what does Ephraim's name mean? Does anybody remember? Kifrani Elohim b'veit Amali. It actually says the opposite of Menashe. Forget about forgetting. Ephraim means to be fructive, to be like the word pri. You can Ephraim pri, lahafrot. So God has allowed me to become fruitful in the place of narrowness, the place of trauma, the place of suffering. So the eldest son is, I hope God helps me to forget my father's, where I came from. And the younger son is, for God has allowed me to be successful even in a place of challenge and impediment and difficulty. So he brings his two sons. It's very clear from these verses that, I don't know if people picked up on this, like nobody asked you, Joseph, to bring your sons, right? It's very interesting just to set the scene. Joseph finds out from some mysterious anonymous person that his father is sick, and Joseph decides of his own accord to go visit his father. Now, it doesn't say he's going to visit him because he's going to pay like he's got to go meet with him because he's not feeling well, so he has to go visit the hospital. Joseph, ever the planner, it seems, at least if you, certain ways of looking at this, is Joseph already is very instinctively trying to place his two children in some position of blessing vis-a-vis Jacob as Jacob nears his end. You can almost imagine like some scene out of Succession, or the show that it was one Succession, right? Where let me position my kids now. I have access to Jacob, and Jacob is now sick, and that means he might be dying soon. Right? He already knows that Jacob is thinking about death because Jacob called Joseph in the prior scene to say, make sure that when I do die, you take me back to the land of Canaan. So Joseph already knows this. And so now someone comes and says, hey, your father's sick. He says, I better get the kids together, right? Maybe I get in there a little bit before the rest of them. Vayaged liYaakov. And then they said to Jacob, and they told Jacob, Vayomer hinei bincha Yosef ba elecha. Behold, your son Joseph has come to see you. Vayitchazek Yisrael, and now not Jacob, but Yisrael, right? The Torah very, very powerfully, you could take the same thing, powerfully shifts names mid-verse, right? To give us now Israel, strengthens himself, and he sits up in bed. Vayeshev ala mita. Like a powerful image, like he's like, okay, I need all of my strength for this, right? I have to really be like ready for this. Now, it could be that Israel is the one who confers blessing, that's a name of blessing. It could be, as Leon Cass has written, that Jacob remembers well what it is to be deceived, and at this moment, his wares are up. Now I'm going to be Israel because I don't want to be deceived. Right? I know deception when I see it. I used to be a deceiver myself until I became Israel. And now I'm going to call out my son to be as transparent as possible. And that's an important moment. It also could be, as others have said, that this is a transformational moment. Jacob, now in his role as Jacob, meets Joseph, but in his role as Israel, as the one who wrestled with God and knows what it is to get blessing, is now going to be present to give this. He knows what's going on. So, Jen, yeah?
So when it says V'yomer hinei b'necha Yosef, is that hinei like hineni, like here I am? Is it the same?
Yeah, there's like a resonance of like hineni. There's something powerful going on in the need the Torah has to tell us like each detail of the scene. And it could be hinei also here. It could be hineni, I'm present, but it could also be hinei, meaning like it's a surprise. In other words, he didn't announce it coming, I didn't announce it ahead of time. And hinei is like sometimes something that surprises, the hinei, and behold, right? Look what happened. But either way, this first moment, this first scene is in some way like the Torah is thickening the plot, as it were, because what's about to happen is, of course, everything about this scene is vital, right? They want us to know that this wasn't planned, that it came, not out of nowhere, but it came importantly, and each piece. So that's the first scene here. I'm gonna stop for a second. I haven't said that. I know that. Let me see. I can't see. My mouse is like doing funny things. Let's see. Okay, great. All right. Let's do the second. Let's look at the second scene now. Vayomer Yaakov El Yosef, source 2. El Shaddai nir'a elai beluz be'eretz Canaan, vayivarech oti. And Jacob says to Joseph. Now this is amazing. Like, stop for a moment and think, like, okay, Joseph now has arrived. What does Joseph look like? Joseph is
Egyptian.
He's an Egyptian. He's still in his Egyptian garb, right? He's still, he's being called Yosef here. Presumably, his two sons don't know. I mean, presumably, he's speaking to his father in Hebrew because his father doesn't speak Egyptian, even if Joseph does. Presumably, the two children probably speak only Egyptian, even though they have Hebrew names. And there's a sense here, like Joseph has not even told him that he's brought his two children. It would seem from later in the text, Jacob doesn't see the two grandchildren. But all of a sudden, Jacob, who's now Yisrael, sits up in his bed and now begins to tell Joseph some history, right? El Shaddai, the God name known as El Shaddai, appeared to me in Luz, the Eretz Canaan, appeared to me in this place called Luz in the land of Canaan, and blessed me, right? And blessed me. Vayomer Elai, and said to me, in verse 4, Hineni mafrecha v'hirbiticha. Behold, he says, I will mafrecha, free, like I will make you fruitful, v'hirbiticha, like pru or avu, right? That both of those verbs here are the same as pru or avu, be fruitful and multiply, right? I will mafrecha, I will make you multitudinous, and hirbiticha, many, right? Hirbiticha, a lot. Unitaticha lekahalamim, I will give you, as it were, to the of you will become a kahalamim, like a community of nations. V'natati et haaretz hazot lizaracha acharecha, and I will give this land in Canaan. I will give the land of Israel to you and to your progeny, your seed after you, acharecha, after you die, achuzat olam, which will be an eternal holding, like it'll be yours forever. Right now. This is an amazing flashback from Lech Lecha all the way through Isaac and all the way to Jacob, and it brings Jacob, he's like standing before the great success story of someone who only became successful outside of the land of Canaan. Like the blessing of becoming successful and fruitful and multiplying doesn't happen to Joseph in the land of Canaan. In fact, he's been, thrown out of the land of Canaan. He only became successful where? In America. In the Golden of Medina, he's in Egypt, right? He's like everything is great, and now Jacob, as Yisrael says to him, listen to me, you Mr. Egypt. First of all, you promised me that you're going back to the land of Canaan and you're going to bring me there because that's where I belong. And lest you think that you belong here, maybe you think that you belong here, but the blessing that I want to confer on this family will not be the blessing of being fruitful and multiplying here in the land of Egypt. It will be fruitful and multiplying, right, and taking hold of the land of Canaan. And so, if you have any designs on staying here and and being I thought that you were going to be my inheritor, but maybe you're not the one. Maybe your destiny is to stay here as well in the land of Canaan, maybe. But your children, now he switches gears in verse 5, Ata, Shnei vanecha noladim lecha be'eretz Mitzrayim. Those two children, two boys that had been born to you in the land of Egypt, he makes mention of that, right? Ad bo'ei alecha Mitzrayim, until I arrived here in Mitzrayim, lihem. I'm adopting them. They belong to me. Ephraim u'Menashe, you see this? He switches the order here. Ephraim and Menashe, right? We had seen that when Joseph had brought them in the first scene, they were Menashe and Ephraim. They were named in the text in the order of their birth. And now Jacob, in his verbal he's saying so much information is being passed over to his son. He says, those two children that were born here in the land of constriction, the land of exile, until I arrived here, they're mine. And then he says their names in verse of their order, Ephraim u'Menashe, Ki Reuven v'Shimon Yulili. They will be like Reuven and Shimon. They'll be like the firstborn and the secondborn of Leah, right? They'll be mine. Interestingly enough, of course, mentioning Reuven and Shimon, two not exactly exalted brothers, even though they had, right? Reuven is the eldest and Shimon is the second eldest, but not exactly like the example of the children that maybe Jacob wants in the world. But in a way, he now says to them, like, I'm adopting them. And then I'll come to the end of the scene and then we'll open it up a little bit. And all of the children that came after, right? Them, they're yours. They'll be included with their, recorded with their in your inheritance, right? But the two, Ephraim and Menashe and Ephraim are now in my lineage. They'll be like the other, right? The other children, the other 11 children, and that's the end of the scene. End of the scene. Scene 2. Remarkable, right? What's Jacob's strategy here? And you'll see in a moment that Joseph is completely taken by this, like very confused. But Jacob essentially, actually, you know what? Let's do the third scene, then we'll come back. Okay? Let's do scene 3 in chapter 48. Yeah? Now, note, like he's just finished this story, and then he says, "Vani, as for me, bevo'imi bat mi Padan, when I was coming from Padan, Meta alai Rachel be'eretz Canaan b'derech be'od kivrat eretz lavo Ephrata." Like, Meta alai, she died on me. Literally, that's what it literally means. She died on me, out of nowhere, it seems, which is, of course, crazy because she didn't die out of nowhere. She was involved in maybe the most dangerous activity a woman could be involved in those days, which, of course, was childbirth. She died during childbirth. But he says his experience is she died on me, right? In the land of Canaan, Baderech, on the way, Be'od Kivrat Eretz, and as we were going towards some distance from Ephrat, which was a place, right?
Still is.
On the way to Ephrat, still is, right? So Ephrata, on the way to Ephrat. Ve'ekbara sham baderech, and I buried her there on the way. But Derech Ephrat, he Beit Lachem, which is whatever. Beit Lachem and Ephrat are identified here. But Yaakov all of a sudden throws this out of nowhere. Now I actually in the previous text sheet I separated verse 8 from verse 7, but verse 7 should really be connected to something to the previous scene. So out of nowhere he kind of invokes Rachel's death in his story to Joseph, right? Out of nowhere he's telling Joseph, right, that he's going to be choosing Ephraim, and it's hard not to hear Ephraim and Ephrat, right? To hear that kind of linguistic connection between the name Ephrat or Ephraim and being fructive, and the place where Rachel is buried, which is called Ephrat, right? And it's hard not to hear the connection between Yosef and his mother Rachel here, and he's basically telling Joseph, I'm adopting your two children, I'm putting Ephraim before Menashe, so I'm subverting primogeniture, and I'm replacing you. Like, you will not have a tribe. There'll be no tribe known as Joseph. Oh, and by the way, your mother died on the way to Ephrat, your beloved mother. That's right. So Rashi, of course, is very attuned to this. So if you look at source number, I don't really know what source it is. It's maybe the next page.
Well, he wasn't well. It could just be he was on his deathbed and he was saying
memory,
random things.
I don't know. Could be. I don't know. But
not so random.
if you look at technology, can be extremely like a practice of frustration here. But like if I were able to. If you look at Rashi, Rashi is very attuned to this, and he says that why did Jacob all of a sudden what was with Jacob all of a sudden deciding that he was going to that he had to convulsively show convulsively show, talk about Rachel. If you look here, you know,
I think perhaps zoom out and then select the page and zoom back in on what you want, or perhaps scroll up.
yeah, that's why, because it was in a double.
Mhm.
Yeah. So just Rashi basically says that Joseph and Jacob had an unspoken, there was an unspoken anger from from Joseph to Jacob, and that Jacob needed to name. You look at source 7, it's a remarkable Rashi. Like, it's just out of like, what? Why did Rachel appear in the story of Jacob replacing Joseph? Because Jacob, at the end of telling him, I'm going to be replacing you, decides to say, oh, and by the way, you might have been really angry at me that I didn't decide to bury Rachel, right, in the place of the matriarchs, in the ancestral burial place. You might be holding this in your heart, wondering, how could you have buried my mother by the side of the road? You couldn't even have taken her. You're not very far from Hebron, where you were. And why did you have to bury her there? Why not just, you could have taken her to Marat Machpelah, to the cave of Machpelah. That's where, Sarah was buried in. That's where, right? Rebecca is buried. So Rashi says here in a tradition, V'lo lachtia v'afilu lebeit lechem, lachnisa to la'aretz. He didn't even bring her into v'yadati sheish b'libcha alai. I know that you have something in your heart against me in the way that the rabbis are reading this kind of almost id-like expulsion of like, oh, and by the way, Rachel died on me. Jacob is saying, I know that you have something in your heart against me. Aval da'alecha. No, Jacob says to Joseph, Shal pia dibur kivarti yashama, that it was God who told me to bury her there. Shetehei le'ezra, like Rachel is supposed to be there to help her children. Shegaleh otam Nebuchadnezzar. So Jacob is saying, like, I got a prophecy from God that in centuries from now, the Nebuchadnezzar is going to come in and he's going to exile all of the Jews, right? And the refugees, the exiles, will be walking out of the land on their way out of the land of Israel, right, in exile, and they'll have to pass by the burial place of Rachel. Yotzei Rachel al Kfura u'bocha. And he says at that moment your mother was not just the mother of you, but the mother of all exiles. Because of course you were the principal exile, you're her son, and you were the one who was most famously exiled. And she's going to be standing there, by the way, and she's going to cry and pray for, compassionately for those children to be returned home, right? And God will bring them home, but in her merit. So at this moment where Joseph is being replaced, this moment where Jacob is essentially saying, it's better if you're not included with all of the brothers. In this moment where Jacob is saying, like your mother, who was also not included with her, right, with her ancestors, who's all by herself, right, by the road, you also will forever remain by the road, as it were, right? And he tries to cast it in a good light, like, meaning, in Rashi's rendering of this, Rachel is now seen as the same way Rachel is by the road. And you might wonder, why was she not included? You too, Joseph, will forever be an example of what it's like to be in exile. You yourself will not return, as it were, and be included, but your children will. Your children will, and your children will be even greater than you, right? Because there'll be two of you and not one of you. You'll have an extra, right? We'll get to that in a second. Okay, stop here. Thoughts, comments? Start in the room, Elliot, and then we'll go to the Zoom.
Yeah. So I'm very taken, by this switch in the order of the brothers, Menachem and Ephraim, and thinking like, well, why does Jacob do this? I think back to basically all of Genesis, where the conflict is between the brothers, and where the younger brother supplants the older brother. There's always this reversal.
It's a reversal of primogeniture, right? The younger brother is always over the older,
It's
right?
reversal. And so,
Cain and Hevel, right? Yitzhak and Ishmael.
and it's really not until I believe Moses and Aaron, where Moses basically is
Replaces him.
thrilled,
Yeah.
you know, that
Oh, he's
Aaron
happy for him,
is
yeah.
happy for him. So what I see here is this kind of Jacob, or those who wrote the Torah,
Fixing a primal mistake.
fixing a primal mistake, and basically,
How so, though?
well, in that this kind of envy and conflict and jealousy that is there with the brothers up until now, all through Genesis, all of, including murder, needs to be reversed. That there needs to be between brothers, between people, and equality, and it's sort of putting aside of these kind of the jealousies and petty, that there is no one is not greater than the other. One brother is not greater than the other, depending on birth. The brothers are equal.
Okay, so I want to come back to that, because I think that's let's come back to that, because it's true that if primogeniture is the rule of the land, that the eldest is the one who receives the birthright. But in the book of Genesis, nobody who is the eldest receives the birthright. This is just in keeping with what's happened so far. So it's like, so far so good. It almost, I want to see how it fixes it, because it's just a replication of what's happened till now, right? Jacob is essentially doing exactly to Joseph what was done to him. In other words, Jacob was the one that should have been chosen, but he wasn't the eldest, and so he got the birthright, but he did it deceptively. So I'm hearing you saying something that is slightly different than I think. So let's go on to it. Let's see. I want to see the other scenes, and I want to see how the text will work through the inversion of primogeniture, but in a different way, because the inversion of primogeniture until now has led to enmity and to violence, right? It hasn't been a good thing, right? So Jacob's being chosen over Esau by Rebekah, not a good thing, right? Esau hates Jacob, right? Yishmael not being chosen, but instead Isaac, I mean, that did not turn out well. Cain and Abel did not turn out well. Nothing has turned out well. And in some way, Joseph being chosen over the brothers, even though he's the eldest of Rachel, but he's not the eldest, right? Didn't turn out well. So how does it, I want to get to the tikkun, but it's happened a little bit later than this. Let's get to that in a second. I want to go Beth, and then we'll come back. Beth, go ahead.
Shabbat Shalom. This vignette where, in essence, the grandfather adopts his grandsons reminds me of the book of Ruth, in which Naomi ends up adopting the child that Ruth and Boaz produced. And there's kind of reverse exilic journeys in each case. There's journeys due to a famine in both cases. And it's as if, because Yaakov has lost his wife, his beloved wife, Rachel, and he can't have any more children with her, he's claiming these kids for himself. And it reminds me of the way that Naomi claimed Ruth's child for herself.
It's very beautiful. It's very beautiful, Beth. Baruch Shekivat, Robert Alter and another number of other scholars have mentioned that it's really, that to bring in Rachel here is in essence to say that she died is a very different take than the take that, let's say, in Rashi's reading, which is like, oh, I still have this unprocessed, unfinished business between me and you, Joseph, and if you're wondering why I buried her, there was a reason, and you might also be wondering why I'm not choosing you, and there's also a reason. But in your rendering and in Robert Alter and others' rendering, it's actually, it's a little bit simpler, which is kind of sans the psychoanalytic and psychodynamic thing that's going on here. Essentially, he's saying, my wife died early and young, and she might have had more children, right? And I'm going to adopt these grandchildren because they actually belong to Rachel, as it were, right? Rachel's legacy, which is, I think, a lot that's happening here, is Rachel's legacy is in Menashe and Ephraim, in a way. And maybe more subtly, back to the psychodynamic thing, maybe Jacob is acknowledging that Rachel's death itself, right, and her leaving the scene early is also part of the entire unfortunate dynamic of loving whom you love, right? Like you can't preference is something that's almost impossible. Like we can all read the book of Genesis and say we shouldn't have favorite children, but the book, the Torah is not it's a human document, meaning it's very connected to humanity, and humanity has preferences. Jacob had preference for Rachel. What could he do? He fell in love with Rachel. From the moment he saw her, he fell in love with her. There was no way to get around that, right? He fell in love with her at first sight. It's the only time in the Bible, he literally fell in love with her at first sight. And then the whole subterfuge, and he loved Rachel's, Joseph, and that's tragic. But that's exactly what led in some way to Joseph being in Egypt and having these two children. And by adopting them, on some level, he's both acknowledging that he was part of the problem. His own preferences were part of the problem, but maybe there's nothing you can do about it. Maybe. Right? Maybe a more generous read will also be that he was also doing tikkun, you'll see in a second, by replacing Joseph. Right? The one who couldn't be replaced is replaced. But let's see the next scene, and then we'll open it up. So I want to get to the next scene, and then we'll just spend the last 15 minutes just listening. But in the next scene, we go back to source 4. Now we're in source 4, which is verse 10 in 48. Ve'enei Yisrael kavdu mizoken. That's a great line. Where that appears in the Torah is in the blessings of where Isaac blesses Esau and Jacob. It says that his eyes became dim. Lo yuchal lirot, he couldn't see. Vayagesh otam elav vayishak lahem vayichabek lahem. I'm sorry, I think I skipped something. Wait, did I skip?
Yeah.
I think I skipped scene 3. I'm sorry, scene 3. Yeah.
He says, who are these?
At the end of scene 3. Vayar Yisrael et bnei Yosef vayomer mi'ela. And Jacob and now Israel saw the sons of Joseph and said, "Who are these?" Now he'd already named them earlier. He'd already named them. So it's going to be remarkable that he says, "Who are they?" Right? Vayomer Yosef el Aviv banayim. These are my children. Asher natan Elohim bazeh. And now Joseph invokes God. God has given me these children. Bazeh in this place. Vayomar. He says. Now bring them close to me, and I will bless them. Right? Joseph has already been setting this up. He kind of the verb "take them to me" is also now regnant with the previous Joseph, Vayikach Yosef, and Jacob and Joseph took them. He took them so that they could be taken now. Right? And he says, "I'll bless them." Who are they? It's a good question. He didn't see them for blessing. Rashi says, "Who are they?" Meaning, I don't recognize them because I see in future generations that some evil people will come out of them, so who are these that I should bless them? And Joseph says, bless them because even though in the future some bad things will happen, they're good kids now. But however you read it, it's kind of an odd moment because you can clearly see, and then in the very next verse that we just read, it says that he can't see. So can he see, can he not see? It's a very odd moment in the text. Can he see, can he not see? But he sees something for sure. Something is happening here for Joseph, for Jacob. And so, once again, let's go back to scene 4.
One before.
It's the mouse. Somebody has to come up with a better system here.
There.
He brings them close and he kisses them and he hugs them, very reminiscent of Isaac, almost exactly the same. And now Israel says to Joseph, he says to Joseph, I didn't expect to see your face. And God now has also allowed me to see even your children, even your seed. And Joseph takes them out from beneath his knees. And he bows low to the ground. And now Joseph will take the two children at Ephraim Yimino. He'll take Ephraim to his right, that is now the left of Israel, meaning right? The right hand is what confers the blessing from the father in the Torah, and the left hand will be the one that would confer blessing on the younger one, right? The right would have
First.
right, exactly. So the right one would be right. It would be ideal to put the right hand onto the bechor, onto the firstborn, left onto the left. So he says, he sets it up the way he wants it to be. Like Joseph sets it up in his way. He's assuming that even though I was chosen because I was the favorite, but I was the fourth one. But now things are going to be right. My eldest should be the one. Like, let's be sure, as Leon Cass reads this, that we are a stable family, and in stable families, it should be the primogeniture should be active here, right? This is my first child. He's my bechor, and my eldest, and the second, right? So that's the way I want us to be, a stable family, right? We're stable. Give a blessing to the right, to the appropriate one. And so, Vayishlach Yisrael et yamino, and now Israel sends out his right hand. Vayashes al rosh Ephraim, v'hu hatza'ir. He puts it onto the head of Ephraim, who is the younger. V'et smalo rosh Menashe, he puts the left hand onto the head of Menashe. Sikel et yadav, he crosses his hands. Ki Menashe bechor, because Menashe is the bechor. Menashe is the firstborn. It's a strange fragment. The end of the sentence doesn't really explain why he crosses his hands. It should be, he crossed his hands. He should have moved the kids around. Why did he cross his hands? Like, why not just say to Joseph, hey, listen, I have a new thing, right? And besides, he can't see. We're told that he can't see. So it's like, it's a really weird thing that's going on. It doesn't really make sense, right? He saw the kids. He didn't know who they were. Now it says he can't see, so that it would seem like his not being able to see should set us up for the problem that happened with Isaac. In other words, if you're the reader and you know the Torah well, you think the fact that the text tells us that Jacob, whom Israel can't see, is a setup now for him to bless the wrong person, right? He blesses the younger one unintentionally. But now it's clear that he can't see, but can see enough to be so intentional that he sees that the ones that are in front of him are mismatched, so he crosses his hands, right? It would seem that it's absolutely not intentional. Everything about it is absolutely intentional. And what's more is Ki Menashe Bechor, because Menashe was the Bechor, seems to be a weird reason for crisscrossing your hands. It should say, right, because, right, Ephraim, like it just doesn't need, we don't need that. Why do we have to, Menashe is the Bechor, so we cross it? And also the word shikel or sikel is a very strange, it means to crisscross. So what's happening here? So I want to come back to what Elliot was saying, and then I'll open it up. Sikel means like the word seichel, which means he did it with seichel. He did it with intelligence. He did it with absolute intelligence.
And with a samech, it actually means to undermine.
Right, he undermines, right. It's also, Sikel means to undermine. He did it with intelligence and in order to undermine, but it also brings up something else, right? It brings up the story of Benjamin, a little bit later in the Torah. If you look over here, a little bit earlier rather in the Torah, in the earlier part of the Torah, in the story of the brothers, remember that Benjamin was being held back by Jacob because he didn't want the last child of Rachel to be sacrificed. Remember that? Right? That was the whole point of the test of Joseph, as it were. And Judah came to the fore, but Benjamin, of course, is the very reason, the proximate reason for Rachel's death, right? Right? Meitalai Rachel, she died in Ephrat, giving birth to Benjamin. And Jacob was holding on to Benjamin, saying, I can't, Benjamin is more important than any of you. Like, Benjamin is the most important thing in my life. Without Benjamin, I have no life. I'll die without Benjamin. And in that moment in the Torah, back in chapter 43, it says, Jacob finally gives in and he finally agrees to have Benjamin taken down. And he says these words out loud. The El Shaddai, or in source 8, El Shaddai yiten lachem rachamim lifnei ish. May El Shaddai, right, just the same God name that is here in chapter 48. May the God Shaddai give you rachamim, right? Place mercy in this person, Ish. V'shilach lachem et achichem acher ve'et Binyamin, and will send back your other brother, meaning like Shimon and Benjamin. V'ani, it says, and as for me, ka'asher shacholti shachalti. As for me, if I am to be bereaved, I shall be bereaved. It's hard not to hear the word shakolti in bereavement and sichelet yadav. It's the same word. In essence, Jacob is saying to Joseph, first of all, how cruel it was that you made me go through that. How cruel was it that you made me think that I was about to lose even your brother Benjamin? What a cruel game that you played. And not only that, he's saying to him, it's like he's saying, I learned my lesson, right? I learned my lesson. You, Joseph, and even Benjamin can be replaced, right? Like I can, like, in other words, like I will be bereaved of you now. This is my final moment of letting go of you, Joseph, right? It's important for me to let go of you and let go of the story of how vital it was for you to be there. That's one way to look at it. It could also be that he's saying to him that I thought that I was going to lose two, the same way you're thinking you're losing two, but I'm actually giving you more. Like more is coming from this, as it were. Sikilet yadav, meaning like all of that is involved here. You think that it's about primogeniture, you think that it's about that, but it's really not about that, right? Maybe even an allusion here that he thinks that Benjamin was more vital in some way than Joseph, or like maybe I wish that I had preferred Benjamin. There's a lot going on in this. I'm going to open it up. The very last moment of this whole denouement, the whole story, is when Joseph says to him, like, Pop, you got it wrong. You confused them, right? And here in this fifth source, Joseph says to him, Yadati b'ni yadati. He says, I know, right? I know that the younger son will be greater than the older son. And I have a vision, right? Even though your plan was this way, I have another vision. And he then blesses them, as it were. The final scene, the final scene, and then I'll open this up, after this whole thing where Jacob says to Joseph, trust me, I did it on purpose. Yadati b'ni yadati. He says, Vayomer Yisrael Yosef, Hine anochi mate. I will die. This is in the fifth source, where I think there's a source where in verse 21. Vayomer Yisrael El Yosef, Hine anochi mate. I'm going to die. Vaya Elohim imchem ve'eshiv etchem el eretz avotechem. He says, I will die, and God will bring you back, right, to the land of your ancestors, right? It's a weird thing. He started off by talking about being in the land of Israel, and he'll finish the entire scene by saying you're going to come home, just like Rachel. Va'ani natati lecha shchem achad alachecha. I have given you one portion, shchem achad, over your brothers, asher lakachti b'yad ha'emori b'charbi u'b'kashti, that I took from the Emori with my sword and with my bow. Now, this last coda is very wild in terms of the tikkun that Elliot was speaking to. Has Jacob, as Israel, really learned his lesson? He's basically done the very same thing his father did, but he did it intentionally. Like instead of having to steal the blessing, Jacob confers a blessing intentionally on the child whom he thinks is the more deserving of the two. But then he says to Joseph, be comforted that you're not going to have, right? You won't have a tribe, but at least you'll have a double portion in the land of Canaan. And the word for portion, Shechem, of course, which means shoulder, it's also like the portion of the cow, like you'll have an extra portion. Of course, has to remind the reader of what took place in Shechem with Shimon and Levi and Dinah. And so it's like this is like, what's really, is there a real tikkun here? Is it a tikkun if you lift up Ephraim and Asher? Some Leon Katz would say that Jacob saved, right? He replaced Joseph, but saved Israel. Because if Joseph had a tribe, it would have been a bad thing. Ephraim and Manasseh are now in. But when he says, I've given you an extra portion, an extra Shechem, is he alluding to some guilt that he sent Joseph to Shechem? And that's where everything happened, right? He sent him down to Shechem. Is he alluding to what the brothers did in Shechem? Is he saying that, right, that in the end of the day, there's no way not to prefer, like what's happening here? I'm just curious, and let's take the next 15 minutes to talk about that, okay? Let me stop and see, I think if there's anything in the room, we'll start in the Zoom this time. So Beth, go ahead. You get an extra portion. It's your second Shrem, your second time speaking. Go ahead. No one else has raised their hand, so go ahead.
Going back to Yaakov crossing his arms and putting the opposite hands on the children's heads, I was thinking about diagrams I've seen of the Sefirot, which are superimposed on an image of the human body as viewed from the back. So in effect, what Yaakov is doing is he's bestowing chesed on Ephraim and gevurah on Manasseh. And it kind of replicates in a way the predominant aspects of Yaakov himself with his twin brother Esav, in that Esav was the hunter. You could see him as a more gevuratic, if that's a word, individual. And Yaakov is a more chesed type individual, the homebody, the one who's softer. And as far as not being able to see the kids, even if the eyesight is dimmed, even if you're looking at other people with your eyes closed, if you're fully sighted, you can still sense the feeling tone of the individual. And I don't know enough about the later history of Manasseh and Ephraim to know how they turned out as when they became young men and then adults. But it's almost like Yaakov is putting these two boys in the same relationship that he and his own brother had.
Shamati, it's really amazing. Like the Me'ashilach, the Ishbitzer Rebbe, has a similar Torah that's the last source in your sheet in source 10, but you don't have to look at it now, but I'll just paraphrase it from you, Beth. He says it slightly differently than you, but in a similar vein, he says that the quality of Gevura, the quality of Gevura that existed in Isaac, because Isaac represents in Kabbalah like restriction, constriction, withholding, that quality identified him with Esav. Like he wanted very much, he connected with Esav, who was, like he said, Gevuratic, or whatever you want to, like he had a certain Gevura. And and because he was very connected to Gevura, and because Gevura represents truth, meaning like the strict adherence to something, the only way for Jacob to be blessed was to completely have it become with a subterfuge. Like it had to be done backwards because Isaac was so committed and aligned with like Gevura, right? But when it came to Jacob, he said had a feeling for what was happening, what God's work was happening in the world, and he actually felt Manasseh needed to be the second, and Ephraim needed to be elevated, and it was back to his he called it not chesed but truth, because Jacob represents tiferet, which is truth, and so he was aligned with God's will, and he didn't have to. He did it with kavanah, with yada, with yidiyah, with knowing, right? Isaac did it unintentionally, but Jacob did it with yidiyah, knowing, because he had a feeling from the sense of who these kids were to be that Ephraim was going to be the greater one. I also think there's a linguistic hat to hang all this on. Like, there's a way to say that, given that Joseph had named his eldest child, I hope I forget my parents' place, like that could never be the one who received the ancestral blessing. Like the entire ancestral blessing is about going home, right, with blessing. You were in exile, you had blessing there, which is Ephraim, whose name means I was like fruitful in the land of pain. And I'm going home, and Jacob keeps saying, I need to bring the child who is able to survive in exile, but then come home. That's the one who needs to be the Bechor. That's the one who needs to be the eldest of two. And that's actually the way that we bless. The Torah says, you should be like Ephraim and also like Menashe, right? Be able to forget what you need to forget, and also, survive and thrive even when you need to. And that becomes a kind of linguistic piece here in there. Okay, yeah.
Can I point out the linguistic connection also in Pasuk Daled, in verse 4? Mafrecha and connects to Ephraim as well. So exactly. The first thing that Yaakov actually says is he's already connecting
Ephraim to his progeny. Mafrecha, you're my fruit. Again, the word fruit and pri connect to each other too. So it's from the beginning, Yaakov is saying it's Ephraim who's going to be the important one.
Right, and so like Jacob is already signaling in the text, and whoever's writing the text is saying, like, it's one thing to be in exile, it's another thing, like, to be in exile and to be fruitful there, but then not to forget to come home. I think that's essentially Jacob's role here, is to say to Joseph, like, you brought us here to Egypt, but your children will be the ones, and I'm the one who's saying you have to go home. If I hadn't told you to bury me in the land of Canaan, you might have been comfortable in exile. You brought us down here, you were successful here, but you would forget where you came from. Because
I see this whole story as a rebuke, as
a rebuke of Joseph.
As of Joseph,
An
yeah.
unfair one.
I agree also that it's unfair, but I think Yaakov is definitely
He's giving him
rebuking. I think he starts off angry that he's trying to be deceived with
by bringing the
grandchildren. I think that's part of the reason that he wants to switch everything up. I think he also what does he say in the beginning? Wait, what was it? I forgot. Yeah, that he's saying, I'm going to take these children as mine.
He adopts them.
He adopts them. I think he's angry that he brought them, and now he's saying, not only going to bless them, I'm going to take them.
Right. Because I don't trust you.
Exactly.
I don't trust that you are as committed, like, to this way, to this path, and so I'm safeguarding them. You can have the rest. I'm safeguarding them.
And yet he's making all the same mistakes over again.
Well, and he has no responsibility
for
the
for
position
doing
Joseph
this.
was in the first place.
Right.
Because he didn't understand the family dynamics.
Right.
So
So in your rendering, so he doesn't understand what brought them to this moment. But what about
anything?
He doesn't
but what about Shechem? What about Shechem? When he says to him, "I'm giving you an extra Shechem," is that a conciliation? Is he saying to him, at least, right? Trust me. You're going to get more than you might have wanted to be for Joseph, but I'm going to give you an extra Shechem, meaning I sent you to Shechem, and that was the bad place.
It's a consolation prize, but
he's also playing favorites again, giving him double. That's what led to the problems in the first place. And as you say, anything bad that happened in Egypt that was caused or continued by Yosef is because of the problem that started with Yaakov favoring him in the first place.
But it goes back even further. Rivka favored Yaakov, right?
I also see
So
an
that's what
echo of
Yaakov knew.
Moshe, where Moshe is not going to be allowed to go into the promised land, which I think is pretty rough. Also, I'm not as learned as all of you, but there seems, I don't know, I feel it's unjust here to Joseph. I mean, I get it, he's making a decision and he's Israel now and not Jacob, but I agree.
Unless the concern is that Yosef has become so Egyptian.
Yeah, Egyptian.
That,
Whose fault is that?
okay, but Yaakov sees that and thinks it's too late for Yosef.
It's so funny. I'm so taken by this perspective because I think that, on the one hand, to see Jacob as like continuing the problem that he started by favoring Joseph on the one hand, but also not recognizing here that he's doing something remarkable at the end of the story. Like, even if he has given Joseph a consolation prize of having two children as tribes, he's removed Joseph's name from the family. There is no tribe of Joseph.
I'd rather have my two sons have something that I can't have.
Well,
Both of them have something that I can't.
Wouldn't that be a great test for Joseph? Like,
I have two sons. I'd rather they get something that I have.
But isn't that the test in all of the book of Genesis, which is, like, can you include two children in one blessing, right? The story of Cain and Hevel is like there's only enough blessing for Cain and not for Hevel. Is it the story of Yitzchak and Ishmael? There's only enough blessing for Yitzchak and not for Ishmael. The story of Esau and Yaakov is that there's, like, even Esau, when he comes to his father, he says, "Is there only one blessing that you have?" So then Isaac has to, like, make a blessing up, right, and give a blessing. And here, like, the problem of Joseph was the problem of, like, is there only one of us that's going to rule? Like, and now Jacob says, I have a great idea. There will absolutely be, right, the right son, the appropriate son, who is like the chosen one. I'll intentionally choose the Jacob in this generation. Not the way my father did it with subterfuge. I will take responsibility, and I'm gonna be the one who chooses the younger one intentionally, and I'll tell you. But he's also gonna become, two of them will be tribes, right? Both of them will be tribes. And you, Joseph, the one that I chose and led to all this, you're gone, I erase you, right? And like the way Judah had two children that were lost from the scene, right? He had Er and Onan, and they're both lost from the scene. And then all of a sudden Judah can become a compassionate, loving father and say, I'll take responsibility for Shelah. I'll take responsibility for Benjamin. Now, Jacob's final test for Joseph is, can you leave the scene and be consoled with the fact that your children will receive what you didn't get? And not be jealous and not wish that you could, like, it's such a natural thing to be jealous of the next generation. And he's like, I'm making sure that they're gonna be named for me. It's gonna be named after me. You don't get it. They're my children, not yours.
What's interesting also is Beth asked if there's any mention of the characteristics of Ephraim and Manasseh. The only thing I know about Manasseh is half the tribe decided to stay outside of Israel, and half the tribe went into Israel. And I find that really interesting.
It's remarkable.
He was a very damaged person and tribe, I think, from all this.
Again, it's like if your name is, I hope my parent, if you're named like by your father and your family, like I will now forget everything that came before me, right? Like, and you're about to go into the land where you're named to forget that place.
But only half of you go.
Right? So it's like an amazing moment, right? All right, I have to, and we now that we started the conversation, everybody, there's a lot to converse about, and a lot of thoughts and opinions. So unfortunately, though, I have to run. It's now 9:46, and we have a bar mitzvah this morning. We'll invite, go ahead, Marilyn, and we'll stay here. Those of you who want to stay and listen, can we participate? And I'll have to leave the scene. Go ahead, Marilyn.
Yes, so I'm just sort of fascinated by yes, he fixes something, but like someone mentioned, I was curious if there was anything about the other brothers, like surely they can do the math and figure that even on his deathbed, now he has given Joseph the coat of many colors again, like from their perspective. And I just wanted to take it right back to Cain and Abel, where God says, to Cain, yep, I chose your brother, and what are you going to, sin crouches at the door, what are you going to do about it? It's almost like, and I talked about it last week, that it's inevitable that things are not going to be fair. Like, we're not even going to pretend that they're going to be fair. So the only thing you can do is, how are you going to handle it when it's unfair? Like, so that's...
Yeah, I mean, there's a problem of chosenness, of course, in the Torah. There's a problem of chosenness, but in many ways, I think that, I think the brothers, there's no mention of that kind of, that particular strand. I mean, there was always tension between the tribes, but in particular, I think that the brothers, they tried to kill Joseph. And the fact that Joseph is no longer named, right, the brother, one of the tribes, is a big deal. And, say what you want about having two portions, it's not the same. Like Joseph doesn't have, he doesn't have an achala. And in many ways, I think that the text of the lesson of Genesis is not that there is no preferential treatment afforded to various members of the family. The question is, can people overcome their jealousies and allow each member of the family to have their role, as it were, and have their place, and still be considered brothers, and still be considered part of the family. And I think that that's the ultimate question of Genesis is, if your brother is the chosen brother, can you still watch over that brother? Because that's like, we don't have a good history with that. And we like to blame the parents, especially in a generation where parents are more often seen as the problem than the solution, and say, oh, I can't believe you preferred the older brother, and we'd like to, East of Eden is ever on our lips. And trust me, I'm the youngest kid, I know. But I think there's a growth here for both the parental figure in Jacob and also the brothers. and Joseph in particular, to be able to leave the scene, right? He says in the end, the only thing he asks for, as the book of Genesis closes, is don't forget to bring me with you. And if Jacob was successful in saying to him, in death, I want to be included with my family, even if there's no name, like I don't have a tribe, that's a big win for Jacob, that the brothers would then make sure to bring Joseph's bones too. And like that's a forever lesson for all of us, like to want to not be on the outside of something and looking in, even when we're not the head of the community anymore, we're not the founding rabbi, we're not the founder, we're not the one in the spotlight, and you have to recede and someone else takes your place, as it were, and you find the right role for yourself and you still participate. It's a big deal. It's a very big deal. All right, so I know that there's more here, but I have to go in. So I'll leave it to Anna to call on people in the Zoom, and then we'll close it at 10 o'clock, and hopefully people will come in, and Shabbos.